Hey everyone, welcome to part 6 of this video series where we're going to be continuing on from the previous part where we put together a full login form in Nordcraft. In this one we're going to be tying in the information that they enter so that we can then store that and then pass that to our Xano API. Let's jump in. So our first job is to get the input that the user makes into something that we can actually use. And we did cover this briefly in a couple of videos ago where we talked about calling Xano's API by passing this information into variables. So the way that we do this is in our page settings here, and if you don't see this then just click anywhere off the canvas here, you can press escape and you'll get to these settings. And what we want to do is to store variables. So imagine a variable is just something that contains some variable information, some dynamic information. So we give the variable a name and then we reference that name elsewhere, but the value is dynamic. So what we want to do is to have a variable that holds whatever they type into the email box, and we want to hold a variable that contains whatever they type into the password box. So what we can do then is to create a variable. We'll just click plus and we'll call this one email. Okay, and we need to give it an initial value. Well, we don't want it to be null, we just want it to be empty, so let's just do that. And then if you notice, it gives us 2 double quotes, and that essentially means that it's inferring that the email variable is of type text, or what we call in programming a string. Okay, and that comes from an old saying that was a string of characters essentially. So that's that initial value is an empty string or an empty piece of text. So let's create the password. Okay, we'll do the same with that one. Just get rid of the initial value and it just gives us a blank piece of text, or as I say, a string. So okay, so how do we get these values into these variables? As a type, how do we get it to store them into our variables that then we can use later on to then send to Xano as our login credentials? So what we do for that is we use what we call data binding. So when we say data binding, this is essentially data. It's not data coming from a database, but it is data, essentially dynamic information. What binding means is that we're binding the input of this box to a variable. So the way that we do that is we click on the input box and we go over to attributes, and then we've got this option here for bind to variable. So then what we can do is to say, okay, I want that box to be bound to the email variable. And so what will happen now is that as we type into this box, it will update that email variable or the value inside that email variable. Okay, so we can do the same with the password. Bind to variable to password. Okay, and that's all that we need to do there. Now there is a couple of things going on behind the scenes with that, so let's just take a look at that very briefly. But if we look here in the attributes, we've already set the binding, but what it's actually done here is it's set the value attribute, and the value attribute is in HTML what the value that is stored in the actual input box itself. And so what we've told it to do there is that the value that's in the input box is actually the variable itself. Okay, and then if we come to events, we've got a event called input. So it says there the event input fires when the values of an input element has been changed as a direct result of a user action. So as you type, this event gets triggered. And so we look at this workflow. We covered workflows briefly previously. Is that we're setting the password variable, but we're doing that programmatically. So you can imagine that as they're typing into, let's say, the password box, with each key press that's triggering this input, and then we're setting the password to the value via this formula here of whatever that they type into the box. And this is how Nordcraft implements data binding. So again, you don't really need to worry about that. All you need to do is to set this variable here to the one that you want for the value that they put in the input box to update that particular variable. So now that we've done that, we can now repeat what we did a couple of videos ago where we set up the service and the API. So let's do that quickly. So we come over here, let's set up the service, let's set up Xano, pop in the base URL, establishes a connection, click tick, and then we're going to add our API. Okay, go to endpoint and we can select our auth login endpoint. Okay, and then what we need to do then is just go to the body where it's already recognized that it needs an email and a password. And all we need to do then is to say that we want the email to be the value of our variable for email, which is what they've typed into the input box, and the same with password. Okay, now notice this, just to introduce this concept, what we call an object. And all an object is something in memory that contains multiple values, multiple properties. So to Xano, when we send our API request, we're simply going to send it an object that contains an email and a password property. Okay, and something to bear in mind when we're talking about objects is an object is always defined with these curly braces here. That defines the start and the finish of an object. And if you remember, if we go into Xano, if you remember when we're looking at our endpoint, where we had our email and password as inputs, if you remember when we ran it, what it actually did was wrap it in these opening and closing curly braces. So that defines that it expects an object that contains an email property and a password property. And back in Nordcraft, that's exactly what we've done here. We've defined an object with an email and a password property. So remember, we need to put an event on the login button. So come to events, over to click, and all we need to do is to call the auth login when they click the login button. Okay, so let's just test that. The trouble is, at the minute, we won't really know whether it's been successful or not because we haven't actually put anything on our form to tell us that message. So what we need to do is to display a message depending on the response that we get. Okay, so let's do that. We'll display a message underneath the button here. So what we'll do, just close everything up other than the button. And what we're going to do, I will add the message text into the same container as the button. So we'll do the wrapping an element that we covered in the previous video, and we'll add it into a div. So now our button, it belongs to a div. So we want it to be displayed below, but we want some gap below it. So let's give it some gap spacing. So we'll go to styling, we'll give it the display layout of flex. We'll pop in some gap spacing, let's say 1 rem should do it. Okay, and now we can put in our text label. So let's add a span. So I'll come to the container that I want to add it into and then do I and then span. We'll actually add 2 because I want to display a message if it's successful, and I want to display 1 when it's been unsuccessful. And I maybe want to style them differently depending on whether it is successful or not. So this first one here, this span, we will say is going to be our success message. So in here I can just say you have logged in successfully, and I will add another span, which I can do actually but just by clicking on the span and doing Command D or Control D, and then we get a copy, and I'll just put in login failed, please try again. Okay, and let's say with that one I want to display the text in red. So we'll come to the text section, the color here, and I'll just pop in that I want that to be red. But obviously I only want to display 1 depending on the result that comes back, and I don't want to display either of them if they haven't clicked login yet, if there's no response to that API key. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. You've logged in successfully. So remember we spoke about in the previous videos where depending on what you do here, when we run it, we get a response and a status of, if it begins with 4, then that essentially means that it's failed. And if it begins with a 2, then it essentially means that it's been successful. So we want to display our message around that based on that condition. So essentially you can imagine I want to show or hide this message depending on whether the response status begins with a 2 or not. And if it does, show it. If it doesn't, we want to hide it. The same with this one, other than that if the response status starts with a 4, then we want to show it, otherwise we want to hide it. So let's do the success one first. Let's click on this span and we'll right click, and we've got this option here for show hide, which enables us to put a condition to say when do we want to show this element. So let's click on this and it takes us into the formula editor, and this is where we can define the condition upon which we want to actually show this label or this span. So what we do, we can come along and we can say that we want to look into the login, the result of the login API call. Okay, and what we want here is the response from that, and then we want the status. So this is similar again to when we ran it. Okay, and when we got the login, then we've got the response, then we've got the status. So we're drilling in to that, and that's exactly what we're doing in our show hide condition here. We're saying all token response status. What we can do then is we can use starts with. So if the status starts with 2, which means it's been successful, that's when we should actually display that label. Now the response status is a number, and starts with is expecting a string value or a text value. So what we need to do is to just turn that into a string first. So we're saying there that the auto login response status, which gives us a number, we turn that into a string, and then we check if that string, that piece of text, which is now either 200 or 400 or 403, depending on the status that we get, does it begin with a 2? And this has to be a string as well, just to make sure that everything matches. Okay, and so what that means then is that only if the response status from the API begins with a 2 is this condition going to return what we call true. So the output is either true or false, and if it's true, then it will show this span, otherwise it won't show it. Okay, now when we talk about true and false, what we're talking about here is what we call a Boolean value in programming. And a Boolean value can only be true or false. So it's kind of like a flag value to check, is it true, is it false, based on a condition. Okay, and then essentially then what we're saying is that if the status as a string starts with 2, that will return true if this condition is met, otherwise it will be false. If it's true, then the label will show to say you've logged in successfully, otherwise it will say false. So we can do the same with the other one. Right click, show hide, auto login, the response, the status. We need to turn that into a string because it returns it as a number, and then we can do starts with, and then we can say 4. Okay, we need to select that as a string. Okay, so this then will only get displayed the message to say that the login is failed if the result, the status of the result, comes back with a 4. Okay, so at the minute this is what's getting displayed because in here we give it the no input at all. Okay, so let's say we run this in the editor now, and then we're going to do our, I think it was abc123 at test.com, and the password was please let me in. Okay, and then we click login. There we go, you've logged in successfully. Okay, let's take one of the characters off of this. Login. That's our login form done effectively. So we've covered some old ground there in terms of connecting to Xano, but we've also covered some new ground in terms of building a new form that we covered in the previous video, and then we've assigned the variables, we've done some data binding, and then we've dealt with the show hide on here. So we started to cover some of the fundamentals of Nordcraft that we're going to be using throughout this tutorial series. In the next video, we'll be looking to build a sign up page and call the sign up API in Xano to allow users to sign up to your app. So thanks for watching, appreciate your time, appreciate you sticking with me, and we'll see you in the next one.